is God's roadmap for Israel and the church? These short Q&As will help guide you on your way. If what you said in episode 1 is true about why Christians should care about Israel, then why are so many Christians apathetic about Israel, anti-Israel, and even offended by those Christians who think Israel is important?
Welcome back to episode 2 of Israel Q&A. My wife Victoria was recently speaking with a prominent pastor about the relevance of Israel for believers today. His reply to her, "You know, the majority of theologians and scholars throughout history would disagree with you." And the pastor was right about that. The church, almost from the beginning, has taught that God has unchosen Israel, that Israel has been replaced in God's plans and affections by the church. If you look in the hundreds of systematic theologies published over the last 17 centuries, you'll notice that none of them has a chapter or section for Israel. They start with creation, go to the fall, and then jump all the way to the incarnation of Jesus. This in spite of the fact that Israel is mentioned 2,319 times in the Bible, more than anything else except God. You might call this cancel culture. Israel has been canceled in favor of the church. Similarly, the great creeds of the church, the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed, have no mention of Israel. They also jump right from creation to the incarnation. This replacement of Israel by the Gentile church began very early in church history and has continued to be dominant to this very day. We call it replacement theology or supersessionism. Israel has been superseded by the church. Now, I know a bit about this because I was one of those supersessionists until about 24 years ago. I was a pastor's son, a lifelong believer, and a pastor. And one day I was reading through Romans, minding my own business, hit chapter 11, verse 1. Paul asks, "Has God then rejected his people?" Since the leadership of Israel had rejected Jesus as their Messiah. Good question, I thought, and answered mentally with this: yes, God has rejected his people. After their multiple failures to obey him, he has given up on them and turned to plan B, the church. So you can imagine my surprise and chagrin when Paul answers, by no means. God has not rejected his people. I am a Jewish believer, writes Paul. There's a whole group of us, starting with the 12 apostles. And one day, all Israel will be redeemed, he writes in Romans 11. Put that in your pipe and smoke it, Pastor Don. Now, the reason I believe that God had given up on Israel is that virtually the entire church for the past 17 centuries has believed that. A colossal and catastrophic error. Paul had seen this coming, and so he warned the Gentile believers in Romans 11, do not be arrogant. But right from the get-go, Gentile church leaders began to teach that God has rejected the Jewish people. The epistle of Barnabas, for example, written between 80 and 120 Common Era, not by the biblical Barnabas, speaks of the covenant being taken from the Jews and their being rejected. It is filled throughout with mockery toward the Jews. Justin Martyr, who was martyred in 165 Common Era, declared to the Jews that the scriptures are not yours any longer, but ours, and that the church was the new Israel. It went from bad to worse. St. Ambrose, who lived from 340 to 397 Common Era, taught this: God has always hated the Jews. It is essential that all Christians hate them too. Imagine, God has always hated the Jews, in spite of what the Old Testament says. The history of Christian anti-Semitism is a terrible litany, not just of words, but violent and murderous deeds. It is a history, though, that God is reversing in our day by awakening many believers to his faithfulness to the Jewish people. He has not rejected them. He will redeem them. This is the message of Bridges for Peace, and some of its many implications I will spell out in future episodes of Israel Q&A.